let's just start. Maybe a few more appear in a moment, maybe not. Let's see, so what I wanted to do today is first talk about principal curves, because we use them all the time and we haven't yet talked about how they are calculated, which, however, will turn out to be very simple. And when we switch over to some working with PyTorch. So let me do it as follows. So I'll try to do it as follows, that I open the file that I prepared here and it's already on the web page, but I will rewrite everything in a new no, you know what I mean, R script. And what I want to do is, let's first have a quick look at where we are going. Principal curves, yeah. Let's imagine we have a point cloud like this one, and we want to make a curve through it like the dashed curve, which is of course what we've been using all the time, but now we do it in 2D so that we can watch the algorithm while it works. And then we will later see that this generalization to arbitrarily many dimensions will be straightforward. And in order to do this, we need example data that looks like this. And so we need a good way to make this example data. And the easiest way that I could think of is the following. I just copy this over from here. I just put a couple of points here. And now I want to make a smooth curve following these points. And the way how I will do this to get a smooth curve will actually be a rather simple way. Namely, I use a spline. So what I do here is I start by making this spline basis. Which works the way how our spline bases have always worked this way. We simply have here one basis function for each knot. So you see, if I have a look at it, basis, this is just the usual thing with 1,000 points, and the points sort of slowly interpolate between them. Let me quickly matplot spline basis. That's usually the easiest way to see what's happening. No, why is there a T? Exactly. This is our spline basis that we always use. And now I simply multiply each, use these here as coefficients for my spline basis. And that, of course, defines one specific spline for the x-axis. So if I multiply this spline basis now with these x positions, not $x, the other way around. Right. Bind. This is how I should do it. When I get this function here, which is now simply the spline basis, multiplied with these things here, and of course this gives us one spline fit. And I can do the same for y. And now what I will do is I use these, what's here the y-axis, I will use as x and y coordinates for my points. So this is the index along the curve, and the points of my curve are the x and y coordinates that I read off from these two splines. The way to do this, of course, is I take my spline basis and I multiply it simply with my two-dimensional knots here. You see, up. The knots is simply these things here as two columns. And if I multiply the spline basis with these knots, then of course I get new two columns, which are more or less these knots interpolated accordingly. And if I now do this, then you see I get a smooth curve through this thing, which already shows you what the whole thing will end up with. We will use this last time we used splines to fit a one-dimensional function or a function of one variable, so simply a mapping of x to y. And now we want to make a parameterized curve, so a mapping of some parameter t to points in our now two-dimensional or later 30-dimensional space. And what we do is that, so I have splines in two senses. The first sense is a spline to understand, to see a mapping from the x coordinate to the y coordinate. And the other is splines in the sense of a mapping from some parameterized coordinate t onto some spline-shaped curve through through our target space. And we simply do this by saying each coordinate of a spline in the second sense is a spline in the first sense. And that's what we've done here. This here is the kind of splines that we used last time. And using this for x and y means that the points here are now connected by this blue curve. And you can see how this roughly works because, of course, our spline basis was done the way that, for example, the first element here is strong, especially for t's at the beginning, and the next element comes strong for t's between 0 and 200, and then for later t values, the green one will be dominant, and so on. And this, of course, means that the curve at the beginning is close to the point which is multiplied with the first dimension, then the point which is multiplied with the second basis, then with the third basis, and so on. And that then gives rise to this thing here, which means this is an easy way to make a sort of nice, smooth curve which goes through a lot of different points. And of course, this is now not a function of y with respect to x, but it's a function of mapping some parameter t, which goes here from 0 to 1,000 to the two-dimensional x and y coordinates. So, and what I now want to do is next, I take all these points which I have here, and I want to make noisy data like this ones here, like these gray points. And the way how I would do that is that I again take my spline basis, like here, but instead of using here sequences which randomly go, which nicely go up from 0 to 1,000 in steps of 1. I say, give me steps from, how have I done it here last time? Give me 1,000 values which all sit between 0 and 1, and calculate the spline basis for these. And if I do this, then of course all these points here, if I now define and multiply this with my knots, the way how I've just done it before, sorry, this goes out, this is this thing, and yeah, now this is my splines, and I multiply them with the knots. And now, as you can see, we get here the points which also sit randomly on this, but this is no longer an order, they just sit somewhere on random. If I take, for example, only 10 of them, then you see they sit just in some random order like this. Let's call these points, just to stick to the same way how I've done it last time. I now simply say I have here these points on the curve, which is something like our pseudotime. And when I calculate the spline at these points, so splines, actually, why do I always write out splines? That's getting annoying. Library splines. And I can use this here. So I take here the B splines, start at T, put all my usual things, which I always have, 10 degrees of freedoms with an intercept, and multiply this by the knots. And this I call X. This is now the points on our two-dimensional surface. And if I do it like this, then I get here these points. But what I will now do is that I add to them normal noise. So I draw 2000 normal numbers with a standard deviation of 0.1, and I rearrange them such that I have two columns. So now I have here this vector of 2000 random values, which I rearrange in a matrix of two columns and 1000 rows, something like this. And I add this to the positions of these points, so that these points are now all a bit scattered around their point. So this is a good way to make random data as we might occur them in real data, but we know where we want to get to. And now we can try to get back to our blue line, which we had in the beginning. We can put in here again the blue line as before. And say, okay, can I get from the positions of the black dots back to this blue line? Just so that you can see it a bit better, I now make this slightly transparent. So, and now, how do we get back to this? What we now do is, we first try this principal curve function just to see what it does, whether it can work with this. So I use the print curve package and call principal curve simply with an x, with our x data, and then you see it gives us back the same stuff that we already know from before, where we have, remember, we have here all these values S here, which are the projections on the curve. So if I take PRC $S, these are the projection on the curve, and now I can say points of these here. Maybe I make them red so that it's easier to see. And I also make them a bit smaller. And now we see here, this is the curve that our principal curve has produced us. And as you can see, the principal curve package hasn't done a good job of reconstructing our original blue curve. But that's to be expected because the principal curve package, no, actually not to be expected because I haven't explained yet why it's to be expected. But what we will see later is that to do a nice, to get that we have to give this principal curve package a nice a proper degrees of freedom, because what it does is it does exactly what I've just used to create my example data. It does this backwards. It tries to find splines for the different coordinates which follow the data. And it tries to find splines using the standard spline function. The standard spline function, if you don't tell it otherwise, here, it assumes, as you see, 3 degrees of freedom. And I just have to tell it that I want more degrees of freedom. So I can tell this principal curve package, df is 10. And then we will see that now it makes a red line which follows the blue line much better. And now I want to show you what this principal curve package does internally under the hood. And here is the algorithm which it does. It works as following. So we want to find a curve. We are given a number of data points x, xi or xk here, and we want to find a curve f such that the data points are as close as possible to the curve. And what we do for this is we always switch between 2 steps. First, we can start off with an initial guess for the curve, which can be anything. And a typical standard thing that people like to do is that they simply say, let's take the first principal component, or let's simply take a line from somewhere around here. So imagine we make a long line like this. And then I project each curve point onto this line. Let's draw it quickly. So we have our point cloud, which might look like this. And now we start with an initial guess for our principal curve, which might well be completely wrong. And we project each point, each data point onto the curve. And when we can integrate here, if we call this 0, we can integrate to the projection points. In this way, we assign to each data point a value t, which is how far the data point's projection is from the beginning of a curve. And then I can imagine that I draw again, so this is now here my two-dimensional thing with x1 and x2. And now I make a graph where I have here t, the position on the curve, and x1 is the position of the x-coordinate of this thing. And you see here, this point here, for example, this point has t-coordinate that much and x1 coordinate that much, or might be here. And this point has t-coordinate a bit more and x1 coordinate also a bit more. And so in a way, if you look at this, this probably looks like something like that. Or rather, I now where to put all these points. As I go from the left to the right, the x-coordinates of the points, of course, increase. And again, remember this, what's the x-axis here is not the actual x-axis, but it's the ordering of the projection points along the curve. And I can make the same kind of drawing with the x2 axis. And if I do it for the x2 axis, then you can see here the x2 axis with a number with increasing t, it goes up, and when it goes down again, so it probably looks like this. And now I have brought it back to the problem that we discussed 2 weeks ago, namely simply we have a cloud point which is now simply on a two-dimensional space, and we draw a line through it by fitting a spline to it. And now I have a spline function, f1 of t and f2 of t, and I can use this to make a curve by saying my curve gamma maps t to the point which is produced by using these things as the first and the second coordinate. And in that way, I now have a new curve. And this new curve will probably be closer to the actual data. And with this new curve, I can again project all my data points onto it. And when each data point gets a new t value, and in this way, I iterate it till I have a good convergence. So that's what I've written up here. I start with an initial guess for this curve, which here I simply said this should be 0, this should be 1. And my curve is so a mapping of a unit interval to the n-dimensional space in which my data lives. And now I need an initial guess. And a simple common initial guess is simply to use a straight line, which goes from one end to the other end. And then a straight line, and you simply make a straight line in the direction of the first principal component. So in that case, you can see here, the first, if you do a PCA on this one, then probably most variance is explained if you project on a line which goes in that direction. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. We can try it afterwards if we start with the wrong initial point and then it doesn't work well anymore. Which means this algorithm works well in practice, but actually not always. And sometimes you have strange effects exactly due to that. And so the print curve package, it uses this guess with a PCA. But in practice, I've often noticed it's much better to look at your data and manually decide, okay, let's choose this point as the starting point. Say this point is maybe the first quarter, this point is the second quarter, and this is the last quarter, and then use something like this to connect them all. So, and what we now have to do is, of course, these two steps. First, we have to assign to each data point a t value. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe what's this about taking the line for the origin? Is this PCA in the sense of the data is assumed to be centered, or as in like some origin with respect?
Oh yes, you are right. Yes, the data should be centered. This is actually badly written, what I've written here. I should better say, center the data to do the PCA, and then take the PCA line and shift it back to the, so that it goes not through the origin, but through the center of the data. In my case, because my data is, well, actually it's not centered because it has its center here. Well, let's see, this might be exactly an interesting point here. So let's start with this and let's make such an origin. So I do a PCA on this data here. And as you can see, it now tells me that this is the slope of the first principal curve. So let's use this here. PC. Why is this actually here called X and 1? So we have here the principal component rho X, comma, my things here is labeled X and Y. I quickly change this, otherwise we keep getting confused about what's X and Y. So I now call this X1 and X2. And if I now do this, still looks all the same, but now my principal curve here, well, as you can see, we label this X1 and X2. And now we know here, in order to put this into this thing, I could now say, if I take now the first principal curve, like this, Swiss work dollar rotation. So this is a vector which points in the direction of the first principal curve. And if I multiply this now with something like my t, let's say R norm, with what could I multiply this? Let's take here times sequence from minus 2 to 2 and length out is 1000. And I put these points into my plot. When minus 2 to, then this hasn't worked. Okay, as you can see, as this, I thought that this would become a two-dimensional thing, but it didn't. So to do this correctly, I guess I have to do this here. No, never. Let me quickly finish this, and then I explain what this is. Outer means an outer product. So it means we have these two vectors here. One vector is here 1000 values from minus 2 to 2. The other vector is here simply these two values. And it multiplies each element of one vector with each element of the other vector. And what we then get is, of course, a two-dimensional matrix with two columns. And that's what I can now plot with points like this here. And as you can see, I get here my value, and it hasn't worked at all. The slope is completely wrong. Is it that wrong? Oh no, it could well be that this is actually the principal curve slope, but it is, as you just said, it doesn't go through the center. So I should add the center, PSC dollar, I think it should have the center somewhere here. Not PSC, PCA. Where have I just put the here? Principal comp. PCA. So I do my PCA, I do this thing, this here, and as you can see, it sits too far at the bottom. And now I should have here in this PCA object here the center, and the center is two values, and if I add them, Again, I get my issue with, as you might know by now, that always whenever you want to add columns, it understands it as rows and vice versa. So I do the usual double T thing again, and now it should hopefully, yes. So let's make here my plot again, because by now I have so many values that you can't see anything anymore. So this was the principal curve directly. Now we do a PCA on the gray data points. I use the first principal component here and make scale this vector by all kinds of values from -2 to +2, or let's say -5 to +5. So this is scaling this PC1 vector by all these values. And then I shift all these vectors here to this middle point, because this is what the PCA has subtracted before to get a center. And this is now a good new, my first attempt for such a curve. So let's call this here curve. And what I now have to do next is to project every data point onto the curve. So I have to project this thing onto that thing. And now there's two ways how we can do this. We can, if I give you a parametric form of a curve like this, and I tell you what is the orthogonal projection of this point here onto the curve, and maybe you start, okay, we have to take the tangent here, and then we have to take something orthogonal to the tangent, and have to find the point on the curve such that the tangent of the curve is orthogonal to the connection of the curve point with this thing. That would be the proper differential geometry way. It's also what I thought what the print curve people did until I looked into the code and realized they do something much more primitive. They simply take every point here along this long line and every data point and find for each data point simply the closest point among this here. You remember I've written here my curve with using 1,000 data points. So I can do this very simple by saying, by choosing, say, one data point. Let's take here the 17th data point and ask which is the closest point on the curve to all these data points. So here's my curve. I subtract from the curve the data point. Now again comes this, will this work, or do I have to first transpose things? Because I'm never quite sure whether this actually works. What I now do is a little trick. I take here the first curve point, or let's take the 10th curve point, and subtract that, and now I will check whether in this difference here the 10th point is 0. And as you can see, it's not 0, so probably I have to do this transposing again. And now let's check whether it's 0 this time. Yes, so this is the right way. But now I wanted not the 10th curve point, but the 10th data point. And now I get here the distance of every curve point to the 10th data point. And I can calculate this distance. At the moment, it's just the difference, the vector difference. But if I square this and add up all these row sums, then I get the distances here. This is the distance of every curve point to the 10th data point. And you can already see the data point, which is the curve point, which is closest to the 10th data point, is probably 12, that one here, 0.443. How do I find this? In R, I can simply use the function called whichmin. It tells me this here is the closest data point. And I make a big loop where I tell it run through all x points. So 1 till n row I. function e. So this tells run through all the values from 1 through all the row labels from 1 to the number of rows of data points that we have, and for each of them calculate here which is the closest value. And we can call this now t, because these are our pseudotime values. So these are now the closest values for each of them. And with this now, what we can do, we can plot, for example, t against the first column of these data points, and we get this, and t against the second column, and we get this. This is now these two lower plots, where I've now plotted each individual coordinates of our data against the position along this long curve. And now that I have this, I can try to do a spline plot by this, using the spline regression as we've always done it. So how do we do that? Curve fits function. What did I do last time? Projection step. Next iteration. We simply use the smooth spline function. Now I can't be bothered to redo all this what we did last time with the BS and setting the spline basics and finding it. I do it very simple. I use the smooth spline function, which is already finished. And this just wants to get t, comma, the y coordinates, and maybe the number of freedoms which we want to have is 10. And then it produces this thing here. And that then would tell us for each of our t points the possible values. Now the question is, from where to where should we let t run? You see here, it runs here from 250 till 750. It doesn't go through all of the points, and that was simply because when I did my PCA here, you remember when I made these points, I just pretty much arbitrarily said, let's run my t from -5 to 5. And that gave me 1,000 values which go along here, but this t here now is the indices in it, and we only need the middle part, because here, if you remember at this, the black line starts somewhere here and it ends somewhere here, so there's a big part at the end which isn't quite finished. So if I now go back to this here and say, how do I smooth, how do I make a, where should I evaluate this spline thing? What you can do here in this thing is, so the way how this works is, you make this smooth, and when you say predict, and tell, for example, predict this thing at the values of, and now if I go back here to my plots, maybe from 200 to 800 in points of, let's stick to what we have before, length out is 1,000. So this is the predict, and this is this thing here, and what it then will give me is new curve coordinates. So let's call them y for the moment. Extra argument, g is missing. So, and now I can add this here in my thing, lines sequence from here to here. I should probably call this t new, so this is my new things, and call this here t new. This is the prediction. Already, and now I can say make a line for using these t news and the y values. Let's see if I've done it correctly. Of course not. Why do we differ in length? Smooth spline, they should have the same length. Y is, this thing helpfully gave me already an x and a y. That wasn't too useful. So let's call here, let's only use the y part of that, because the x part is simply what I put in with t news. And now I can put the line, and now we see the new line that we have here. Call is red. So this is the line that it has now added. This is the spline it put around this in order to follow this data here. Didn't do a very good job in fitting. Maybe if I had used more splines. But it's in a way it's understandable because here, so for a moment, we might be disappointed and say, why can't it follow this thing here? But of course, remember, we are trying to fit a function, and here the curve actually goes backwards. So because the curve goes backwards, the function cannot really follow it. So for example, this function point is here because it's effectively a mean between the data down here and the data up here, which both have the same t coordinate. So in that sense, this is entirely proper. It's just that our curve points are probably in the wrong order, so that we cannot quite see how these curve points are. And in order to see this better, what I now do here is I go back to what we've done here, where we assign to each, where we, where was it? Plot. So this is again our original plot in the real space, the lines, the PCA, and now here the curve. And now it's a bit hard to see which point is, right, I haven't shown you the curve yet. Curve is this thing here. Curve. Exactly. And now what I now do here, my curve is the PCA line, which is this line which goes slightly through it here, which maybe I should try to add it here. Lines, curve. Yep. And now I can look at, for each point here, which value gets assigned to it. And you can already see our trouble. This point here, for example, appears at a later point in the curve than this thing. This here has a smaller t value than that point here. So the t values increase and then they go backwards again. Because we follow this thing, but if we just project, we first project these and then those. In order to make it easier for us to see what's going on here, what I now do is I plot again the points, but I show you the colors. Color, ramp, palette, 100. Now what do we use? Let's use Viridis, Cividis. So this here means make, how many do we have in T? Make 1,000 color values which interpolate according to this Cividis thing. And I get this here. And now I use this T here, which you see is all these numbers in some strange order. And if I put this behind, then it will reorder the colors according to this, that colors with a low value will get here a yellow, and colors with a high value will get here a blue. And here these are both in the middle value. So in this way, I can now see what T has been assigned to this. But I'm not quite happy with this because it's so hard to see that this is a later point than that. So maybe I use our cube helix that we used last time. That's better. Because this cube helix had this little thing that we can tell it how many rotations it should do. And if I tell it do this, rotates around the color scale several times, then we can see here, really see here these lines of where the t value changes. All these have the same temp, all these have the same t value. With this now, we can again do our prediction. Here I said this is the plot for the second. This here are the new t values. And these are the predictions of the new t values. And I have to do this not only for the first, but also for the second. So I can do it as follows. S apply 1 to 2, so around the 2 coordinates, function j, and now I don't need this j here, and I tell it fit a spline to the mapping from t to the jth coordinate, and check the spline along these numbers from 200 to 800. And when we do this now, what we will get out of it is our new x values. So now we have a new curve value. So this is now our new curve. And with this, we can now check how the new curve looks like by again plotting our data points. All gleich gray. And adding our curve points. Curve. And now we see our new curve. And now we project everything onto the new curve. And when we do this, then of course we will get them better in the proper order, because now this thing is no longer slanted, but like this. So I copy over what I've done before here, my Widgemin, this one here, and say, what is now with a new curve, the minimum things, and now get a new t value. And now I can again do the plot that we've done before here with the cube helix, like this. And now we see, now the whole thing works better. This time, the t doesn't follow here vertically, but now they seem to be in the right order. And if I now do this again, now I have my new t values, and with the new t values, I can tell it again, give me a new plot of t to this values 1 here, and here we see now everything again. We also see the t values start here this time at -100 and this time at +800. So maybe I should change this here a bit and say, okay, my new t values will be something like minimum of the old t values -100 and maximum of the old t values +100. I add a little bit so that this curve moves a bit out to both sides. And I apply this. And now I plot my new curve, and now you see it already looks quite good. I project again with this t and plot again. So here we can look at these different things, plot individual coordinates against t, against current t, data point coordinates against t, and this is now here for 1 and for 2. Then here expand the range of t a bit for regression. That's what we do here. And then fit splines to each coordinates and get spline values along expanded t range. That's what we've done here. And now I can here plot improved curve. And then we again say get new t values by projecting. And projecting again means for each curve point we find for each data point we find the t value of the closest curve point. And with that I get now this. And if I now run through this a 4th time, then probably nothing much changes again. So 4th time, predict it, plot things, make a curve, make the minimization and show something new, and now it more or less stays as it is. So this is what I've put here. So this is again our data point. Repeat until convergence. We extend the curve by extrapolating a bit at both ends. actually here when I've written this last year, I said extrapolate it linearly. So my idea was I simply take this thing and add a line here and here. But just while I was typing this, I thought that's actually much easier because I have a spline here and I can simply evaluate the spline a little bit further outside and it still would work nicely. When for each data point xi, we find the t-value of the closest curve point. And we do this now this time simply by saying our curve is never explicitly spelled out, but it's simply described as a list of 1,000 curve points, and we simply find the closest of these curve points or the index of the closest ones. And this gives us a new ordering of the data points. And then we can get the new curve by regressing each individual coordinate against its of a xk, sorry, the k here is wrong. It's of a whole I should this be, ik point. I think I've messed up whether I is the numbering of the points or whether I is the iteration count. Yeah.
That my method doesn't fit very well on the boundaries. So if we
I just thought I can skip over that, but now that you ask it, let's do it properly. So yeah, I guess what you observed if you played with a spline is that often what happens is if you have data like this, when you use the spline smooth function, then what it likes to do is that it does something like this, and then once you expand the spline outside, it does something like that it shows a lot of extra curvature. And this is a known problem with a nice solution, namely the so-called natural splines. Natural cubic splines, do we have them here? No? Yes, only mentioned. Okay, let's explain it. So the issue where this comes from is that our usual splines, the way how they were designed is, you remember we make these piecewise polynomials which add up to something. Actually, we can easily see the origin by looking at what we had last time. Smoothing, spline regression. Here, you remember these are our curves, and if you look closely at them, they don't exactly go smoothly into zero. In the middle, they do this nicely. They go down and get smoothly and nicely into zero. But here, they slam a bit into the zero at the borders. And if we then look later, you might remember at the very end, we even had a plot of the second derivative, so of a curvature, when you see that the splines at the sides have much stronger curvature than the splines at the end. And the very first and the very last spline, which should be here, I think, the black and the red, they have really strong curvature. So if you have strong thing on this, then what you get is it might go out like that. And then because the rightmost spline has so much curvature, that's a strong second derivative, it then outside the data, it changes like this. And the solution is simple. We should change our spline basis into a spline basis where the outermost splines also go down to a curvature of zero. And the way how you do that is, and we see if I manage to do this. So let's say I take B splines here of 0 to 1,000, comma, let's make sequence 0, comma length out is 1,000, and df is, let's do 5, and intercept is true. And matplot, this is usually the fastest way to plot such a matrix by saying plot each row matrix as a out with T. So matplot simply takes each row or each column of a matrix and plots it as one such thing here. And now instead of BS for B-spline basis, I simply write NS for N-spline basis. And when I get this replacement spline basis, which it looks a bit stranger, but this replacement spline basis is now designed such that it runs out always in a straight manner with zero curvature. So somebody thought hard about how can I replace the B-spline polynomials, which we got with this de Baer construction, by a slightly different formula which does that. And whenever you have a spline which you may want to extrapolate towards outside the definition of the data, you're always well advised to switch from the BS to the NS, which probably I should also have done here. So let's see if this makes things better or worse. I start here with my X. So, find the minima, like the new one, and yes, this is the point where I should tell the smooth spline now that it should use N splines instead of B splines, which I don't know how to do. We probably would, if this smooth spline thing does the fitting automatically using BS, we probably would have to switch it over using NS. If for fitting we were to use the code that we developed 2 weeks ago, where we didn't use smooth spline but did the regression ourselves, we could simply replace the B with an N, and otherwise it's all the same. But with a smooth spline, it doesn't quite work that well. So spline is based on the function spline design. Okay, interesting. Good. Yeah, so this was, where are we now? Here we are. One more back, principal curve. So this is the principal curves, and here now I have written this a bit more properly than I have done now, when I quickly try to do it now in R so that you could follow. It was, of course, maybe so that it makes sense when you watch me coding it, but here I've tried to write it down in a way that it makes more sense when one reads it. So here you see how I've done this. I started with my PCA, made this initial guess, which is simply the straight line. Then here I made my plot with the cube helix in order to see how the point colors are. And now we first do the regression step, where I call smooth spline for each of the 2 coordinates in order to get new fits. And here you can see how these fits now look. That's the plot that we looked at, and that's the one for the other coordinate. And then here I made my new target space. As you can see, last time I did it not by simply adding and subtracting 100, but saying let's subtract or add 30% of the total range to be not fixed to this things of 100. And now I get my new curve by calling predict on each of the 2 fits, keeping the y-axis. Now I can plot the new thing. Now comes the projection step. When I wrote it here, the projection step, you see, here I did it in a lazy way. What I've written today to do my projection step, where is it? I used this, here I used this apply function, which goes through the whole, which goes through each data point individually and calculates the difference of each data point to every curve point, which is a huge amount of calculation, but it still was fast because we had 1,000 data points and 1,000 curve points. That's 1 million distance to be calculated. And when you have this matrix of 1 million distance values, and in each row, we want to find the minimum. And that's, of course, still something which happens in a millisecond. But if you have much more data, then you need to do something a bit more clever. And you might remember from a month ago, we had looked at this functional nearest neighbor package, which takes a whole bunch of points, and then you can give it a whole bunch of other points, and it finds for each point in the second list the nearest neighbor in the points of the first list, which is of course exactly what we want. So that's what I do here. I say find for each point in query the nearest point among the points in data. And last time we used this, we got the 20 nearest neighbors because we wanted to make a nearest neighbor graph. This time we only want the very nearest neighbor because that's our projection point. And with that we get now, so this is how I got the nearest neighbors here, and it gives me all the distances which I ignore, and here the t values which I keep. And then here I did one more thing a bit more closely, because when I project these points, my actual t-value, I said, should be the integral from the start of the curve up to here. But this time I simply used the number of the point. So I implicitly assumed that the distance from each curve point to the next curve point is the same. When I did this last time, I did it properly and calculated the distance of each curve point to the preceding curve point, and noticed they are all the same. Actually, I remember that I wanted to make a little note at that point to figure out why they are all the same, because I'm not quite sure where I put this into it. Of course, I started off with randomly spaced t-values, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all these points are the same, because if I have if my x1 coordinate in t and I fit a spline and it looks like this, and for the other one I fit a spline, it looks like that, then of course here the value is always the same, but here the speed along the curve increases because the thing has here a curvature. And technically, this should mean that when the curve points in our data space should no longer be equally spaced, but their spacing should depend on that. I remember that I looked at this last time and wondered why why it's always the same. Maybe I didn't look properly. Maybe I've overseen some facts that we somewhere internally figure it out. So if you want a puzzle, try to find out whether these are always equidistant, and if so, why. I'm pretty sure it's pretty obvious once you think about it. But I remember last time I gave a lecture at that point, I thought I should think about that, and then I have forgotten, and now I just remembered again. Anyway, what I did last time here, you see, because I wasn't sure whether they are always the same, I take here all the positions of all the curve points except for the first one. So I start with the second curve point. And here I have a position of all the curve points except for the last one. I end one before we end with this. And now I have here this list of all curve points except the first, and here the list of all curve points except the last. So if I put these two matrices next to each other, then I always have two adjacent curve points on the same row. So if I subtract them, then what I get here is the distance from each curve point to its next curve point. And I square them and take here the row sums and take the square root to get the Euclidean distance from each curve point to the next one, and have here now the length of each individual curve segments. And if I add them all up with a cum-sum function. Cum-sum means cumulative sum. It gives me a vector where the first element is the first element, the second is the sum of the first two, and the ith element is always the sum of the first I vector elements. And that, of course, is exactly what I want if I imagine I were to integrate the curve length along this thing. And so this cumulative sum gives me for each curve point the distance of this curve point from the start, simply calculated the sum of all the distances from each curve point to its neighbor for all the preceding ones. And in that way, I can now get my new time by just checking for each For each cell, I check which curve point was the nearest neighbor. Here, I check here in my cumulative sum, what is the closest to them. In my cumulative, how far is this curve point from the starting point, and then I know what the t values or the pseudo-time value for this data point is. And then I plot again using colors to indicate the pseudo-time value and plot my curve, which as before looks completely weird at the beginning, but now it will become better in the next thing. So we make the next iteration and so on. And in order to have it properly, I've written here this function which does this all in one big go. So this is one iteration of the principal curve. So it gets data values, pseudo-time vector, and the current curve. And if we don't have a current curve yet, because we do it for the first time, it uses the principal component. And then here it does the smoothing and calculates the new curve, the fits. Here it extends the grid, and here it now actually reads out the splines to get the new curve when it projects its data point onto the curve points, calculates the length segments, the distance from start, assigns the pseudo time, and then returns what we've now got, the new pseudo time and the new curve. Well, here I made a for loop where I always say, run this thing, get the result, so the new pseudo time and the new curve, and then the next for loop, the result from the previous iteration will be handed to the new iteration. And every time I make a plot, so I see how far I got. With iteration 1, iteration 2, iteration 3, 4, and I think from 4 onwards there's hardly any change anymore. 5, 6, now I don't see any change anymore. Of course, I could have done this better instead of just looking by eye whether I don't see any change. I should have done this properly by asking, does the curve change? By taking the previous curve and the new curve and calculating their distances to see whether the new curve and the previous curve actually have changed a lot. So I could take each curve point of a previous curve and each curve point of a current curve and each curve, the corresponding curve point from the previous iteration, calculate their distance, add up all these distances, and if I notice that all these distances between the previous and new iteration is only a very small number, then I stop. Okay. Yes. What have I written here? Yes, here last time I've written here, we could of course at this point wonder about whether we want to do a proper projection, as I said here, with tangent and so on. But in the meantime, I thought about it and realized it's actually never worth the effort, because finding the closest value by comparing 1,000 points with other 1,000 points only takes in milliseconds anyway. But one important point that you can see here is for this spline regression, which is internally in there, we can substitute the smooth spline function with any other function. We can substitute with a function which does the smoothing using natural splines instead of B-splines. Or we can use the local regression that we also tried out last time and do it, or some kernel smoothing or whatsoever. So you can put in whatever you want. And actually, the principal curve function of R gives you this choice. If you print curve, normal point, principal curve. If you look here at its help, it tells you that you can use, that it has here this function smoother, and where you can tell it use the smooth spline function, or use the lowest function, which is this local regression, or it even has a periodic lowest where it tries to make not an open curve, but a curve which is close to itself. And what's here missing, but that you can easily add, is also a smooth spline, which uses natural splines or whatever you want. And importantly here, you get 3 dots, which means any extra parameter which you give to the principal curve function will be handed over to the smoother function. And if you now know, for example, that the smooth spline function, not with a dot, that the smooth spline function wants a df parameter, or wants when you can change how many degrees of freedoms you have. Smooth. Switch. Yeah.
So in the documentation, you said at the end is the dot dot dot, and that means that the extra arguments are passed to whatever smooth you have?
Well, this is not, it says here so. Definition of a smoother, and here says additional arguments which are passed to the smoother. So if you do this in R, sometimes you might write a function like this here, that you define a function where we might say f is function x, comma, some argument, some other argument, some function which should be called, and some dot, dot, dot. And when, let's say, the function does something like taking x1 plus func applied to x2, comma, dot, dot, dot. If you write things like this, then you can later call f of a, comma, b, comma, c. And this will then be, and this will then end up in a plus ff b, comma, c. So this is one of these typical functional programming tricks, that you can hand over a function which is then called internally here, and the function gets extra arguments which you move over. And it's especially useful for something like this, where you have, like here, where you have an outer function like this principal curve function, which calls an inner function as its workhorse, and you want to modulate the behavior of the inner function without opening up what's inside the outer function. And so you have this quite commonly in R and in other functional languages, that you get these slots in order to push through an argument, through an outer function into an inner function. So, further questions about that? Okay, now you can imagine how this works when we did this for our single cell data, where we had this trajectory, which we looked in a 30-dimensional space, when of course this thing was no longer 2-dimensional, but 30-dimensional, and hence we fit 30 splines in each iteration, one for each coordinate component, and put together a thing, but in all this, it works nicely. What you can also see from this is that the whole thing can have issues with starting points. So for example, a classic thing, imagine you start with something J-shaped like this here. And when the thing tries to start with this, and then it will think that this is the first curve point and this is the last curve point. And sometimes it never gets it right. It then gets stuck in this minimum and never manages to put this over there. Which means that in practice, you often then have to take a UMAP and find in your UMAP maybe something like sleepwalk, where everything really starts and where it really ends, and somewhere in the middle. And then you manually define a start curve and tell it, maybe try to start with this curve from here to here to here to here. And can work. So that was one thing. The other thing that I wanted to look inside in case there's time left, and now we do have a little bit of time left, is, should say here below, but I have forgotten to hand this over. Let me do this quickly. And this is just to already start a bit. Jupyter Lab. No. Forge AutoCAD. Is the right thing? Yes. As you might remember in the PCA, I said that we can also understand the PCA as an optimization problem. And our general optimization problem is we have data x1 till xn, which are all from some big data set xn. And what we did is we said that we want to move this to a PCA space, Z1, Zn element Rk, where k is much smaller than n, and we do this by saying Z is some matrix, let's call it A times X. And A is, of course, an n by k matrix, which reduces by dimension. And then we go back from that with x hat is A to the minus 1z, or A transpose times z, or something like that, to go back to x. And I write it generally with B. And B could be A to the minus 1. And now I get back my new x, and when I say we want Vx, we want that the difference between the reconstructed x and the original x summed over all our data points, this should be minimal. And we want to find the matrices A and B which allow that. So the matrices argmin A and B, such as I argmin A, B, such that B, A, xi minus xi gets minimized. And one way, and we then used general arguments to show that this gets minimized if we build A from the first principal components of the matrix of all the data vectors X, and construct B simply as the inverse of A. But you can generalize this more and say what we do here is what we call an autoencoder, where we have data xi from a high dimensional space, which gets moved by some function. Yeah.
Sorry, but B wouldn't quite be A inverse square, right?
Yes, sorry, I should simply say AT when it fits here. Because we said that A is built from the eigenvectors, which are orthonormal, so we can undo the rotation. So we have here a function which I call the encoder function from Rn to Rk, which gets us to the Zi. And when I have a decoder function, Rk to the Rn, and this gives us back the xi hat. And what we now have here, we have a problem that we want to find the functions f encoder from some function space and the decoder from some function space, such that decoder after encoder applied on xi minus xi gets minimal. And what this does, in a way, it's an information compression scheme. The information compression scheme means that we have n-dimensional data which we compress down to only k numbers such that we can reconstruct the original n numbers. And if we ask the question in general, then how much compression we can achieve depends on which function space we allow here. Here, in that case, our allowed function space was just linear mappings, or actually affine mappings, because what I've forgotten to say here is we first subtracted the center. So it's actually not just a matrix, it's a matrix after a subtraction of a vector, or a matrix followed by the addition of a vector backwards, which we call generally an affine transformation, this combination of a shift and a linear transformation. And if we only have, if our function space only allows us affine transformation, then the PCA is the best we can do. But if our function space allows us general nonlinear transformation, then we can do much more. So a typical example would be exactly what we've just looked at. If I have my point cloud looks like this, and imagine this would be in some high dimensional space, then maybe the best compression would be to fit our principal curve and say the length along the principal curve is the first coordinate among these k coordinates, and the second coordinate and the remaining coordinates somehow describe this residual vector. And in that sense, I can then make this as good as possible by trying to get this right. And in the residual vector, if I lose some information, that doesn't this doesn't cause us too much loss here. So some terminology. This thing here we call the loss, because that's the amount of information we have lost. And the bigger that is, the more information we have lost. We also call it the reconstruction error. In a way, this here is the reconstruction error, simply the difference between them. And the average reconstruction error, average over all data points, is the loss. We might consider the loss not here as the explicit sum over an explicit number of given data, but rather say there is a probability distribution which produces data, maybe a distribution which somehow sits like this here. And this probability distribution, and we want to minimize the loss in the sense of saying what is the expectation value of this squared norm of the difference under the data distribution. And our aim is to find the function in the given function space which minimizes this. And in this case, if we do this, this has a double advantage. For example, let's imagine we have some three-dimensional data, and we know this data lives on this two-dimensional surface of this Coke bottle here. And then you can imagine it should be possible to put a two-dimensional coordinate system onto this thing, which allows me to describe with two numbers where the point is on this bottle surface, as long as we know that the points are on the surface, so I can compress down from 3 to 2. Or more generally, if I know that my data sits in a submanifold, then I can find a map for this submanifold, and hence, if this allows all kinds of diffeomorphic map transformations, then it's easy to find that. In practice, in order to minimize such data, what we need to do is parameterize these functions. So we need a further way to have some parameter space, let's call it M. The mapping of a parameter space to our function space. So when we give you parameters, and this gives a function. So in this case, for example, the parameters are the matrix elements, and then we get this function. But if you want to have a nonlinear function, then maybe it's something else. So we need a parameterized function space where we can describe each function in the function space by a long vector of parameters which describe the function. And the standard way to do this is to make this neural network idea, where we make a combination of affine transformations, when a standardized linear transformation, when again an affine and a linear transformation. And in that way, we get various different, we have a very rich function class, which in principle can hopefully describe a huge function space efficiently by many parameters. And in order to do that, we then need a way to minimize this, because here we use logical reasoning of saying, yes, in order to find the perfect approximation, we can use a general theorem which allowed us to say we simply have to use the eigenvectors. But in the general case, we can't do this. We simply have to minimize it brute force. We write our problem like this. Start with some random function, parameter vector, which defines some random function here. Calculate the loss by putting in all our data elements. And then we take the gradient of the loss with respect to the parameters of the functions to see which parameters of the function we have to tweak upwards and which we have to tweak downwards so that the loss gets reduced. And then we make a step in this direction by tweaking all parameters a little bit and recalculate the loss with a new function. And we tweak them again, and we recalculate the loss with a new function until we find a loss which is small enough for our purposes. And that's what I wanted to start today, or tell it to you a little bit more. But let's start here with for the last 5 minutes with the most primitive thing, because as you can see, what we in general need is a way that we have a general function which we want to minimize. And here, let's first start that we write, I've just taken this example function here. It's just some function I came up with. And as you can see, it takes two parameters, which I didn't call x1 and x2 because I switched to Python. You know, in Python, everything is zero-based. So I called it x0 and x1. And here is my function. And the point here is this function we imagine would be opaque. You can't see it. You only are given the function, you can call it, but you can't look inside it. You don't know the formula for the function. You only know there's a black box where you put a value x and it gives you the function value. And can you minimize this? And of course you can. You just have to try around. It gets even better if you also have a second black box, which when given a function, when given x value, gives you not only the function value, but also the gradient. And when you do the following, which is probably something you already know, so just first to see this is the function I put it. And as you can see, my function here with this cosine, it wiggles a bit, and here I put some parabola, and in the end, I made it such that the minimum should be here at 0, 1 or so, I think. Yes, I think if I made it correctly, the minimum is down here. 0 minus 1, actually, not 0, 1. Doesn't matter. Should be somewhere here. If I were to calculate the gradient manually, and after I tried it 3 times, because you know calculating derivatives is something you know very well in your first year math studies, and when you lose the things or when it takes a bit, but I managed to calculate my derivative correctly. And so I put here the derivative. I even checked that it's right. You see, I calculated my derivative at 0.43, and they told me it's 23 and 12.9. And then I checked the first one by taking 4.0001 minus the value at 4 and got that. And here the same by adding a little small value on the second parameter, and also worked. So from this point check, I'm reasonably confident that it's right now, because it was only right on the third try. but eventually it was. And now let's assume you are given only these two functions, f and df, but you can't look inside them. And you can simply do the following. You start at some random value, 4 and 3. Might give out, okay, at 4 and 3, the function value is 51. And now we change the function value x a bit by subtracting the gradient. So df of x is the gradient, and I multiply the gradient with a small number, which I call the learning rate, and subtract this from x. So the new x value in the next iteration is the old x value minus 0.1 times the gradient. And then, of course, because the gradient points upwards, and I take minus the gradient points downwards, so this makes a step down. And hence, if I do this step, with each step, of course, I get closer and closer to it. And as you can see here, after a few steps, I got quite close to that. Let me quickly show you that this actually also runs reasonably fast. Here is my function, this here, and here is now, it only took a few milliseconds to do this 40 gradient steps, and after 40 steps, I'm really close to the true minimum of this here is 10 to the minus 6, so essentially 0, and this is essentially 1. And 0 and 1, that was where the minimum was supposed to do. And but as I told you, all these, all the autoencoder stuff that we will talk about next time will mean we consider this here, this whole thing is our objective function. We consider this as a function f of theta, where theta is the vector of parameters which parameterize these two functions. So we minimize over a function space by actually rewriting the function space as an ordinary vector space of Rn. And then we can do the same thing. But we will run into the problem where if this Fe and Fd are very complicated functions, when calculating the gradient, this here, by hand will be really annoying. So we want some way to get this gradient automatically. And this is the great new thing, that this is called automatic differentiation or automatic gradient. And since 20 years or so, or 15 years, it worked really well. And this is probably one of the crucial ingredients for the current AI revolution, this automatic gradient calculation. Because this is what's going on in all AI systems. You're looking for a function which brings your input into the desired output and as close as possible. And I quickly show you how this automatic differentiation works. I use the PyTorch package, which is this main Python package that everybody uses for AI research. And one of the core functionalities of PyTorch is automatic gradient. The other core functionality is working on the GPU. I come to this in a moment. So I rewrite my function with one little thing. This time, instead of numpy cosine, I say torch cosine. Otherwise, it stays all the same as before. The next is my starting point, x here. Previously, I said I want a numpy array with these two arguments. Now I say I want a torch tensor with these two arguments. Technically, a torch tensor and a numpy array is the same thing. It's a slab of data. But the torch tensor, people call it a tensor because it has a couple of nifty extra features. And the most important one important extra feature is this here. You can tell it, I later want to get a gradient of something with respect to this tensor. And prepare to be able to tell me derivative with respect to this x. And here you see how this now works. I get my tensor, torch kind. I get my function, I get my tensor, and now I can calculate y at the position x. It returns me a single value, but it calls the single value again a tensor of size 1. And now I can do, say, y dot backwards. And this means I want to be able to calculate the derivative of y my function value, with respect to all the tensors which I have indicated as requiring a gradient. Y dot backwards tells it what the numerator of our derivative is. We want to get the gradient of y with respect to x. And if we do that, we get here now our result, which is 23 and 12, which is exactly the same as I got up here, 23 and 12. But this time, I didn't write this function explicitly. It didn't use that. It inferred this function by itself from this part here. And the way how it does that is by keeping what they call a computational graph. So it remembers that it knows that y is that y was something like f of x, and f of x was the sum of two tensors, namely the left tensor x squared plus 2 times torch, and the right tensor, which is x1 minus 1 squared. And this thing is, of course, the square of a tensor which is x1 minus 1, and that is the effect of subtracting a 1 from the tensor x1. And on the other side, I can also do the same, and there's also some x0, and this x1 also goes a bit here, and I don't want to draw this, but you can imagine that if now I can write any expression I can write as such a tree. Specifically, this is not a tree, this is a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, because we have here this thing feeds into two parts of a tree and merges again. And each of these things is a computational operation which is well known for Torch. Torch knows how to add tensors, and it knows the rule for taking the derivative of sums, namely you add the derivatives. It also knows the rules for taking the derivative of products, namely the product rules. And the most important part is it takes the rule, it also knows the chain rule, because if we now were to write down the derivative of f with respect to, say, x1, you would basically start. This is the derivative of f with respect to the right summand times the derivative of this thing with respect to that thing times the derivative of that thing with respect to this thing, and so on. So you have all these chain rules, and if you want to calculate the derivative, what you have to do is each step upwards means one application of a chain rule, and each circle here, each operation is the derivative of a respective thing. So for example, the reason why I had to replace NumPy cosine by torch cosine is because the NumPy cosine function only knows how to calculate a cosine. The torch cosine function also knows that the derivative of a cosine is minus the sine. And if I then say y dot backwards, it will move this tree upwards, and once it passes at the cosine will calculate minus the sine of its things. And in the end, all of them will push their values upwards, and the values will all aggregate in these boxes at the very top, and that's where we can read them out here. The whole thing is a bit magic, and it takes a while of thinking about that. This is really possible, provided the thing keeps all these intermediate tensors, all these intermediate hubs here in memory until we've calculated all the gradients we need. And with that, we can now easily do our integration as before by saying we start at a point, calculate the function value at this point, calculate the automatic gradient, subtract the automatic gradient, and then we end up somewhere here. And basically, there's a lot of stuff around this, and next time we will play a bit with this to see what we can do with that, to see how this minimization with auto differentiation is really at the heart of all modern machine learning. Yep. Rest comes next time, but I already wanted to give you a thing, and if you want to solve a puzzle for yourself, try to think if you were to write something like Torch, purely conceptually, how would you set this up that it can do automatic gradation using these graphs and the chain rule? Actually implementing this is, of course, very difficult, but already thinking of a conceptual thing, which information do you have to store and how long, and which connections do you have to keep, it's already quite instructive. Good questions, remarks, other points about that? Otherwise, we close, and yeah. Tomorrow, I guess, in the exercise class tomorrow, I think we'll mainly focus a bit more on the aspects that we started looking into last time. We can try, maybe we try this optimization on this one aspect that we already tried last time, which didn't work, provided I get it to work till tomorrow. There was something else I wanted to do with you. Forgot, but I remember again. But it was something about programming skills that we noticed last time that some of you might want to practice a bit more, and I'll try to find an exercise for that till tomorrow. Okay, see you tomorrow, otherwise next week.